Hello and welcome. Is the English language actually destroying the world's diversity rather than uniting it? The term globish has been coined to describe how a global version of English has grown in popularity, and it makes people ask whether the widespread use of English is hurting the linguistic cultures of countries or promoting multinational ties. Due largely to the economic, cultural and military dominance of Britain and the United States, English has become the world's language when it comes to conducting international business and diplomacy. There are an estimated 328 million native English speakers and as many as 1 billion people around the world learning it as a second language. But at what price to their native language and cultural roots? On today's show we ask, is the worldwide spread of English promoting global understanding, or is it simply linguistic imperialism? You can join our conversation by calling into the show or by sending us an SMS or an email. Now, joining me now for the discussion is journalist and author Robert McCrum, who's, in addition to co-authoring the international bestseller, The Story of English, has just written Globish, How the English Language Became the World's Language. He's in London. And in Copenhagen we have Robert Philipson, a linguist and professor emeritus at the Copenhagen Business School. He's best known for his research which denounces linguistic imperialism and looks at the relationship between language and power. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show. And Robert McCrum, if I could start with you there in London and just get a quick summary of what globish is. It's a term that I guess many people wouldn't have heard yet.
Well, globish is not my term. It was invented by a Frenchman, in fact, who was in Japan in the 1990s. And what he spotted when he was in Japan, he was a man called Monsieur Jean-Paul Nerrière. He spotted that when non-native speakers, Japanese speakers of English, used English in conversation, they did better conversationally with Koreans and Vietnamese and so forth, i.e. other non-native speakers, than they did with English or Americans. In other words, the non-native speakers do better when they have a slightly simplified version of the language than they do when they talk to somebody who has it where there's more nuance and more variety. And he coined the term globish, and I borrowed it.
Let me ask you what the difference is between
English language.
Yeah, well, what's the difference between globish and pidgin English?
Well, a pidgin is the first generation of a contact language between peoples who are not who are communicating with each other, who don't share. So a pidgin will evolve in somewhere like the Caribbean, on the slave ships during the period of during the slave trade and the period of the Middle Passage. And a Creole is then the second generation pidgin, but a pidgin is much more. It's a contact language. It's much simplified. And what I'm talking about in globish is something which is more of a lingua franca.
Okay, let me bring in Professor Philipson here. So good to have you with us too there from Copenhagen, and ask, if everyone learned globish, wouldn't that knowledge have a democratizing effect on those who aren't already native speakers of English?
Well, I agree that the Frenchman who invented the term is right, that people often understand others who are using English as a foreign language more easily than native speakers. Native speakers make far fewer concessions to other users of English. But this doesn't mean that the kind of approach that he has to learning the language is relevant for learners of the language. In other words, there's no quick fix to learning English. If English is a school subject, if it's used in higher education, in universities, then what people need to have is competence which is related to the diversity of English when it's used by Americans, by Australians, by South Africans, by Indians. They need to be able to understand a diversity of types of English, whereas in terms of what they need to produce, they need English which can express their own cultural identity and their own specific needs. And the needs of the business community, which this French guy was particularly focusing on, are very limited by comparison with what general education does.
Okay, well, Robert McCrum, we had an email, if I may put to you, from Bangladesh, where our viewers write in, as you know, from around the world. Mishal Ahmed wrote in saying, English does not pose any threat to the cultures or mother tongue of the countries it infiltrates, unless those countries choose to give it away. How much power does a country have to stop the onslaught of English, in your opinion, Robert?
Well, I mean, obviously, a country like France, for example, they become very defensive about the spread of English within French culture. But I must say I agree with the gentleman from Bangladesh. Mother tongues are very, very powerful, far more powerful than, I mean, globish English it's an ersatz. It's a very ephemeral. It's very limited, as Dr. Philipson has pointed out. It has a very limited role, and I think we should also at this point draw a distinction between the written and the spoken. But I think the truth is that the mother tongue is the essential tongue, and so that in Bangladesh and all across India you'll find the ordinary man and woman will be using their mother tongues in the home, on the street, and in all kinds of social situations. But if they need to communicate with one another for business or cultural purposes across India, then they will then default to Globish.
Okay. Robert, a quick thought. In your book you say essentially that the English language has become a source of power in itself, and you highlight how people in countries all over the world are taking the language out of its imperial context and appropriating it for themselves. And you use Al Jazeera as an example. Explain how.
Sorry, can you repeat that last bit
the
again?
last bit, yeah, because you cite Al Jazeera as an example of that, of how the English language is used as a sort of source of power in a way. Explain what you meant by that.
I was having a bit of trouble with the hearing here.
With Al Jazeera, I mean, how would you say a channel like Al Jazeera, you know, you're saying it can be used, English language can be used by outside sources that don't have it as native language, and then they utilize it as a sort of, effectively as a power, or creates a sense of power with it?
Well, I think in the case of Al Jazeera, and of course like any other global TV station, it's a way of spreading ideas and the cultural influence of a station through the language. And of course, I think one of the phenomena we have to deal with at the moment, which is absolutely new in the history of the planet, is that for the first time in recorded history, it is possible for the English language in some form to be both transmitted and received anywhere in the world. I mean, this program could be transmitted, probably is being both transmitted and received all over the world, and it will be, and there will be within a radius of its reception point somebody or many people who will understand it, and that is an absolutely unique phenomenon. It's a real breakthrough in understanding, and I think for those of us, I don't really myself believe that it's necessarily going to be a source of global harmony, but I think that you have to agree that if people can talk to each other, then this is a step forward. Okay.
Well, Dr. Phillipson, an email to you, if I may, sir. This came in from a viewer by the name of Riz Khan, same name as mine. It says, though the colonists are long gone, English has stayed and flourished because all new technology is invented and introduced by those who speak it. Now, it's true that technology is often very English-centric. Why do you think that is when there are such big consumer markets outside the English-speaking world?
I don't think that's correct. In any case, I was in Korea last week and I tapped one key by mistake, and that meant that what was on the screen then was suddenly Korean rather than English. So it's not true that all invention is taking place in English. But I'd like to come back to what was said earlier, because Al Jazeera presumably also functions in Arabic, and that's because there are very large numbers of people who have Arabic as their main language who do not understand English. And when I talk about the risk of English being an imperialist language, one needs to remember that any language can serve either good or evil purposes. It's a question of what functions it has. And when, for instance, Robert McCrum writes in his book that English is the language of ordinary people as well as the language of power and authority, well, it is the language of ordinary people, but only in countries like the United States, Great Britain, South Africa. No, not even South Africa, because English is the language of power there, and most South Africans cannot use English. And this means that the history of the British Isles, of the United States, was trying to impose one language at the expense of others, and largely succeeding. Most of the indigenous peoples of America and Australia have been forced to assimilate to English or French. And this means that this was also the pattern that was attempted in the colonial period in much more diverse contexts, and has not succeeded in the same way. But it doesn't alter the fact that English is the language of the elite and not the language of ordinary people.
Okay, we have Ramzi on the phone from Ramallah. Ramzi, what would you like to ask?
I wanted to comment on the situation of the Arabs. Unfortunately, I feel that the use of the Arabic language has deteriorated, and Arabs and the Arab educational systems have to pay more attention to the proper uses of Arabic. I don't mean ancient classical Arabic, I mean modern standard Arabic, to be able to absorb English as a second language and still maintain their cultural identity. So there's you know, a push and a pull, and you have to be careful about the balance.
Ramzi, that's an interesting point, and actually, Robert McCrum, there's an interesting, point there about Arabic, and it's very common in Hindi movies, in Bollywood, for example, for more and more English words to creep in, and it's now almost this kind of combination of Hinglish, as it's often called.
And the same thing happens in Singaporean English and Hong Kong English. It's the capacity of the language to infiltrate the local language, and you can either deplore this and see it as Dr. Phillipson, I think, implies, see it as a sign of imperial dominance, or you can say it's just the nature of the language and it's comparatively harmless. And I don't think, I think the giveaway in his remarks is when he refers to the Aboriginal peoples of America and Australia. I mean, yes, of course, the settlement of North America and of Australia and other parts of the world involved terrible genocides of local tribes, and there's a great need for the preservation of the language of those tribes. But generally speaking, the imposition or the settlement of English around the world was not of that sort. And the point of my book is to say that actually in the 21st century, the point of what I'm trying to say about the 21st century is that really for the first time you find, Riz, you probably see this in your travels, that you'll see people using English without really any sense of the linguistic imperialism that Dr. Phillipson refers to. I mean, it's now being used in a much more neutral way, and I think there is a case for saying that Globish is for the first time comparatively imperiousness free.
All right, we'll get a response from the professor in just a moment. We have to take a short break. When we return, we'll look at that and also look at how perhaps languages are dying around the world and what might be done to preserve them. We'll be right back with more of our discussion in a moment. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the global spread of English and its effect on world languages and culture. Joining me are journalist and author Robert Crumb, who's joining us from London, and linguist Robert Phillipson, who's joining us from Copenhagen. And Dr. Phillipson, I want you to get a response to what Robert Crumb was saying about the more general use of English rather than this sort of imperialistic use. And as I bring that up, also it's interesting to know that the language most spoken by native speakers is Chinese, which is by far the largest. And I wonder if you could also add into that the thought of how Chinese influence around the world, which is growing, might actually have an impact on the way Mandarin and perhaps some Cantonese might actually emerge in language culture as well.
Okay, but I disagree with the analysis of Singapore, because all instruction is through the medium of English in schools in Singapore from the beginning of school, from grade 1. And this means that the ancestral languages, meaning Chinese, Malay and so on, are only learnt as subjects, so that the pressure on people to drop their languages in favour of English is massive. And it's now the case that half of the families of Singapore actually use English as the home language. So there's very clear evidence there that because of government decisions, English is being promoted at the expense of the other languages. And if you take the Arab world, which there was a question about a moment ago, there are many elite Arabs who go to English medium schools, often Anglo-American schools, and who go to universities which use the English medium exclusively. And this, of course, is part of the explanation for why the Arabic language has not been developed as a language of science and technology. It is, of course, used in business. English is not the only language of business.
Can we talk about Singapore?
One second, Robert. Just let the professor finish, and I'll come back to you in just a second.
Sure.
Professor, go ahead.
I've been to the Emirates a couple of times, and in the Emirates, many kids who arrive at an English medium university who are Emiratis, meaning wealthy, have not had their Arabic developed enough in school because they've been to English medium schooling, and their English isn't good enough either. And this is a crazy situation. It has to do with governments not thinking through their own language policy, how to get people really competent in a local language, and how to give them, in addition, really good competence in English.
Interesting point. And Robert, I want you to respond to that, and also the fact that I guess people are pushing for English as a language so they can have a global competitive advantage when it comes to doing business.
Absolutely. I just want to take up the case of Singapore. The case of Singapore is very interesting. It's like a language laboratory, and I've watched it for not closely, obviously not as closely as Dr. Phillipson. I've watched it reasonably closely over the last 30 years, and of course the language policy of Singapore does reflect essentially an authoritarian regime, making no doubt bad choices. But the attempt by Lee Kuan Yew, who I interviewed actually many years ago, was to try to solve the linguistic incoherence of the island. And the island itself is a state which has been trying to benefit its people economically through this very well, they've tried different things. They've tried Mandarin, and then they've gone back to what they call the English first policy. But it was done in good faith, I think, by the government, which is indeed an authoritarian government. It was an attempt to liberate the people from the incoherence of the linguistic inheritance.
Okay, let's get a caller in from the UK. Imam's on the line with us. Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please, Imam.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. Nice to speak to you.
Good to speak to you. Let's have your question.
I'm a West African. I came from Sierra Leone, and we have 16 languages in Sierra Leone, 16 tribes with different dialects. But with the coming of English in Sierra Leone, it made it very easy for us all to have one general language. So that's a very big what should I say?
Right.
It's kind of
an advantage
for us. So to say English is becoming an imperialistic language, I don't believe at all. It's very good for the world.
Okay,
for us all to have one English for one language that we all can communicate in.
Imam,
yes.
let me put that question to Dr. Phillipson also with an email that touches on that from the UK from Tariq Al-Basha, who says, does the decline of other languages in exchange for English have political and economic outcomes for those countries? Now I wonder, Professor, what our viewer of Imam there was saying along with this email. It suggests that there may be some benefit then if there is if the language is replaced by something like English.
Well, obviously, the proportion of people in former colonies in both the British and the French colonial countries in Africa is very, very small. And clearly English is the language of power. That's why everyone wants to learn it. That makes sense. But on the other hand, when, for instance, a writer like Ngugi from Kenya has been a very successful novelist in English and chooses to write novels as an alternative in Kikuyu, it's because he wants to reach a different audience. And if you want all of the languages to thrive because they're important for people's heritage, then you need policies which, in fact, encourage multilingualism in education, not either or, not either African languages or English. And this is exactly what is being done in many parts of the world. And interestingly, just to go back to Lee Kuan Yew, he now regrets not concentrating more on Chinese, because as you mentioned earlier, Chinese is in fact incredibly important and is increasing importance, and the Chinese know that.
Actually, Dr. Phillipson, a quick question for you about what is coming out as fairly disturbing news. Experts are saying that by the end of the century, half of the world's roughly 6,000 languages are likely to go extinct. That's about one language dying every 2 weeks. And I think earlier this year, the UN identified 18 languages with only one remaining speaker. Now, how would you describe what the impact is for the loss of a language for a nation or people?
Well, there's a pecking order of languages in any given country, and English happens to be at the top many places, but not everywhere. There's a need for many languages, but the pecking order means that if English is dominant, for instance, other languages, Swahili may be important in Tanzania, and then the rich diversity of hundreds of languages in countries like Nigeria and Tanzania will be disappearing as time goes on. And that is a tragedy, because knowledge of how to manage biodiversity, cultural diversity, are embedded in the languages. And that's why it's important that the risk of half the world's languages being finished by the year 2100 or even more is in fact a very considerable one, because of mismanagement of language policy in the country, in particular in education.
Robert McCrum, we had an email from Greece, if I could put to you, from Vicky Nikolaidis, who wrote in saying, I'm fortunate to have English as my first language, yet I'm sad because the language isn't particularly flexible enough to meet the needs of different cultures. Now I wonder, when you have this kind of situation where people say it's, English is an advantage, but of course it has its limitations, is it just simply a case that people have no choice but to embrace English? It's the language of the air, it's the language of the sea, it's the language of so much technology and still dominates the internet. Is it a case of having to literally embrace English with no choice?
Yes, because I think that's true, and obviously there is a sadness involved in this. One regrets that, but it's clear it is a lingua franca, and as Latin was, you know, 1,000 years ago. That's the role it plays, and it brings with it problems. And obviously, for your Greek correspondent, it's a disappointment that it's not more flexible and more useful to her. But she has her mother tongue, and she probably knows other languages from the region. So that English is, I mean, to go back to the multilingual point, it becomes part of a menu of options, linguistic options, available to a Greek, to a Turk, to a Cypriot. And if a Greek and a Turk wish to communicate about something of serious consequence, politically or economically, they will default to the lingua franca, which is English, and that is, in my view, promotes some kind of harmony, and that's probably a good thing.
Okay. Professor, just a minute to go, so I just want your view on, you mentioned about the poor policies of governments in terms of preserving their languages. Is it simply the responsibility of governments, or is there another way to police the loss of these languages and the loss of the linguistic strength that certain nations might have? Just a brief answer.
Well, obviously there should be much more bottom-up movement, because people who speak a small language typically do want to maintain their language. And one knows from the way Welsh and now Scots Gaelic are being promoted much more in the United Kingdom that this is not at the expense of learning English. But I'd like to say one more general point, and that is you don't get far in Latin America with English. You don't get far in Southern Europe with English. So the idea that English is the only really important language in the world for cultural, economic, political and all sorts of other purposes is simply not true. There is a much greater linguistic diversity.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, there I have to stop you, unfortunately, because we're out of time. A fascinating conversation. We conducted in English. I wish we could have done it in others, but thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for being with us, and remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the topics and post your questions and comments. On the next show, Divided Democracy. As voters in the United States prepare for the midterm elections, we examine the stakes involved and ask, is the vote being hijacked by big money and political extremists on both the right and left? Be sure to tune in for that from me and the team. We'll see you next time.